Sciences unearth facts about the predictability of behavior. Knowing about that predictability not only allows you to tell what'll happen when, it allows you to explain why behaviors happen. And that means you can potentially control them. The science of learning is about how organisms will change their behavior in predictable ways to adjust to the orderliness of their environments. So, in what sorts of ways can your environment be orderly? What does it even mean to be orderly? And in what sorts of ways could you change your behavior so that you can adapt to that orderly environment?
By this point in your life, you've probably got a pretty good idea of what it means to learn something.
That's for sure.
Oh, you bet I do.
Of course I do.
Well, yeah.
Well, you can forget it. In psychology, the word learning usually means something a little bit like what you might expect, but also maybe not so much. In order to understand the history of this field, and way over a century of research, you'll have to think of your world as put together in just a few very particular ways, just like learning theorists traditionally have. And that means everything is either a stimulus or a response. So instead of behavior being predictable from things like how people make judgments, or from how they take in information about their environments, or from what other people do, and so on, learning theorists ask how stimuli, mostly the predictability of stimuli, can change our responses in predictable ways. The study of learning, then, is about how all sorts of organisms adapt to the predictability of their environments in predictable ways. So, what is it that makes our environments predictable? And in what sorts of predictable ways do we adapt? You might have heard this somewhere before, but for people who study learning, the world is made up of nothing but stimuli and responses. The particular stimuli you can predict and the specific responses that you can change might be infinite, but they're all just responses or stimuli. So if what you learn is that things going on in your environment, stimuli, are predictable, there really can't be too many things you can learn. You could learn something about a single stimulus showing up predictably. But it could also happen that some stimulus shows up whenever some other stimulus shows up first, or whenever some response happens first. In other words, you could learn that two different events are connected. And that would be, you guessed it, associative learning. What if there's a stimulus around that doesn't seem to be predictable from anything but its recurrence or continuity? What could you, as a learner, learn from some stimulus just being around over and over and over again? A change in responding, an adaptation, that happens because some stimulus just keeps going on and on and on, or keeps coming and going over and over, is called non-associative learning. If that stimulus is something relatively weak, like maybe the sound of cars driving past your apartment or the fan on your computer, that adaptation is called habituation. Stimuli make responses happen, and whatever response this particular stimulus would normally cause begins to go away. You can think of that as an adaptation because responding to stimuli that are continually around, but that are so weak that they don't have much of an impact on you, would be a waste of any critter's time and energy. But if the stimulus is something intense, its continuity or repetition causes a change in responding called sensitization. Responses to other stimuli become stronger than they normally would be. As if you become especially, sensitive to the goings-on in your environment. That could be adaptive too. Again, you might say that its continuity is predictive of continually having to deal with this intense stimulus. So the change in responding involves somehow preparing, physiologically, for something intense to happen again. Getting aroused, pumped up, vigilant, extra sensitive to what's going on. And if you keep doing that, you'll become over-prepared for any weaker stimuli that come along, and so might react more strongly than you otherwise would to stimuli that normally wouldn't produce much of a response. A common way of thinking about this is that arousing, stress-producing, intense stimuli are the kind that show up in risky or dangerous situations. And so being alert to stimuli that might pop up along with those intense stimuli could allow you to stay away from risks or dangers that you might not otherwise see coming. In fact, there was a study done recently showing that injured squid that could feel their own pain were less likely to get eaten by predators than injured squid that had been anesthetized. What could that have to do with sensitization? Well, pain is an intense, ongoing stimulus, and so it would cause sensitization. The squid that weren't anesthetized would be more likely than they otherwise would be to respond to other stimuli. If one of those other stimuli just happens to be a predator, then the squid would be more likely to avoid it than they normally would. Learning that involves one event being predictable from some other event is called associative learning. What creates that predictability, at least when it comes to research with animals, is usually a contingency between those two events. And remember, there are only two kinds of events. Learning that your own behavior might be making some stimulus show up or go away is called operant conditioning. And learning that one stimulus will show up whenever another stimulus shows up is called classical conditioning. The best known example of classical conditioning is undoubtedly Ivan Pavlov's research with dogs. A dog might sometimes have heard a bell ring, that's a stimulus, and then have gotten food, another stimulus. If getting food usually only happens after the sound of the bell, then the dog could learn that food shows up, predictably, at the sound of the bell. So the dog could change its behavior in some way to adapt to that predictability. And they do. The bell starts to trigger a cephalic reflex, just like eating food does. Operant conditioning, on the other hand, involves learning that what happens with some particular stimulus depends on whether the learner has performed some particular behavior first. If a rat presses a lever and then gets food, it should eventually learn that getting food is contingent on the lever being pressed. Press the lever, get something to eat. And it could change its behavior in the future to take advantage of that predictability. If you were a hungry rat, what might you do to take advantage of that predictability, to take advantage of that contingency between lever pressing and getting food. You know, when I was taking a learning course, it always nagged at me that there seemed to be just these two kinds of associative learning. I mean, classical and operant conditioning. And I finally figured out that it's because if the world is nothing but stimuli and responses, and we're learning how they're connected, then there should be a couple of other associations that could show up in our lives and maybe be learned. We've covered one stimulus being predictable from another, and we covered a stimulus showing up when some response happens first. Shouldn't there also be a couple of other associations that could be learned? Oh, you bet. A reflex is a contingency, an association, between a response and some stimulus that causes it. That connection is wired in, though. Responding to that stimulus doesn't have to be learned. But you could learn that when some particular stimulus is around, it'd be a good or bad time to do some particular response. You could learn to associate that stimulus with the response that followed it, the response that got reinforced or punished. And so you could learn to associate that stimulus with the stimulus that followed the response. In fact, famous guy B.F. Skinner called that a three-term contingency. What gets learned is a set of associations among the discriminative stimulus, the response, and the consequence. That's a field of study called discrimination training, or stimulus control, and it's typically lumped in with operant conditioning. A response is going to be reinforced or punished, but only when it follows some particular stimulus. And one last possibility is that a response could be contingent on another response. In other words, doing one thing could lead to the opportunity to do another thing. Actually, that's a relatively new way of thinking about operant conditioning. And we'll talk about it when we cover operant conditioning. We've just covered 4 forms of learning. Which type of learning is illustrated by each of the following changes in responding? Whenever your friend offers to drive you somewhere, you take him up on it and also pay him for the gas, plus a few bucks extra. Before you know it, your friend is offering you rides more and more often. Your neighbor's dog barks all day long while you're trying to study. After an hour or so of being distracted by the barking, you're eventually able to focus all your attention on studying. Your dentist is a smidge impatient and doesn't like to wait for painkillers to kick in before getting right to work on your teeth. So after a few appointments with her last year that involved painful dental work, just the sight of her office makes you feel fearful. You find yourself stuck in a grocery store that plays really loud music for its shoppers. One of your fellow shoppers is so steamed about the noise that she finds a way to unplug the equipment that's playing it. After a brief moment of very welcome silence, a small baby sneezes demurely, and it scares you. Some things you can't prepare for, but some things you can. When a stimulus that's been around before keeps showing up again, or just never goes away, you could adapt to that continuity by losing your response to that stimulus, if it's a weak stimulus, or, if it was a strong stimulus, becoming more sensitive to any stimulus. That's non-associative learning because that stimulus isn't associated with anything except itself. And I'm not sure how many learning theorists would actually want to describe it that way, but let's walk on the wild side. Sometimes that predictability comes in the form of patterns of events, associations. When one stimulus consistently shows up with another, you can adapt to the first one by getting ready in some way for the second one. Or when your behavior consistently produces a pleasant or unpleasant consequence, you can do that behavior more or less to get outcomes that feel good. And if there's some cue to whether this is the time to do that behavior, if you want to get or avoid that consequence, then you can adapt by discriminating between situations in which you should or shouldn't do that behavior. Learning can be studied scientifically because the ways in which we adapt to predictability in our environments are predictable. Knowing the ways in which our environments can be predictable, and there aren't that many, and how we adapt to them will put you in a position to understand where changes in your own and others' behaviors come from, and maybe allow you to do something about it. Which type of learning is illustrated by each of the following changes in responding? Whenever your friend offers to drive you somewhere, you take him up on it and also pay him for the gas, plus a few bucks extra. Before you know it, your friend is offering you rides more and more often. In this illustration, the change in response involves an increase in how often your friend offers you rides. It looks like that change in response happened because getting extra money was contingent on him offering to drive you somewhere. That makes this an example of operant conditioning. Your neighbor's dog barks all day long while you're trying to study. After an hour or so of being distracted by the barking, you're eventually able to focus all your attention on studying. In this illustration, the change in response involves a diminishing response to a single stimulus that keeps showing up. As the dog keeps barking, your attention to the dog gets weaker. That makes this an example of habituation. Your dentist is a smidge impatient and doesn't like to wait for painkillers to kick in before getting right to work on your teeth. So after a few appointments with her last year that involved painful dental work, just the sight of her office makes you feel fearful. In this illustration, the change in behavior involves a new response to a stimulus that didn't used to produce one. You became fearful when seeing your dentist's office. The painful dental work, one stimulus, would have been contingent on seeing her office, another stimulus. So this is an example of classical conditioning. You find yourself stuck in a grocery store that plays really loud music for its shoppers. One of your fellow shoppers is so steamed about the noise that she finds a way to unplug the equipment that's playing it. After a brief moment of very welcome silence, a small baby sneezes demurely, and it scares you. In this illustration, the change in response involves a much stronger response to a stimulus than you would typically have. After a long period of exposure to the music, a very intense stimulus, you overreact to the baby's itty-bitty sneeze. That makes this an example of sensitization. You know, being able to sum up these videos in a simple statement or two, without just listing the topics that were covered, is a good sign that you understand them. So how might you sum up the substance of this video, what it says about learning, in just 2 or 3 sentences? Maybe even just one. How about learning is all about adapting your behavior in ways that take advantage of the predictability in your environment? Well, there's not a whole lot of detail in that condensed summary. It's fairly abstract, but if you know and understand the material in this video, you should be able to see what sorts of questions would have to be answered in order to come up with a more thorough summary. Questions like, to what kinds of situations can we adapt? In what ways are the changes in responses that happen adaptations?